He hit the woman who raised us, but he didn't know who was behind the door. I came back without warning and saw everything. Look what silence led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. The decision to come back had come to me simply, quietly, like the wind slipping under a door in the dead of night. I had imagined it differently. Maybe a laugh when she opened the door, maybe tears in her tired eyes, maybe the warm smell of something cooking that made the whole place feel like a home again. But that wasn't what I found. And maybe deep down, I had known it wouldn't be. I'd been rotating through outposts for nearly 2 years without rest, never staying long enough to call any place mine. Some days the uniform felt heavier than the gear strapped to my chest. In the Army, everything is loud orders, explosions, expectations. But what gnaws at you isn't noise, it's silence. Silence after a letter that never comes. Silence in the voice of someone you love, trying not to burden you. That was my mother. That was the woman who raised me. Her letters were always careful. They were small windows into the life I had left behind, painted in neutral tones. "Liana is growing fast," she wrote. "Kisses from your old room." But never anything about herself, never anything about Kevin, and never once did she ask me to come home. Still, I came. I had no mission, no official leave. I simply packed what I had and signed out. No big send-off, no promises. The only promise I carried was the one I made to myself when I was 12 years old, the night she told me I could stay with her forever. She had made no show of it then. Just folded my clothes with those tired hands and told me my name didn't matter, that I was hers from now on. I promised then that I'd protect her, no matter how far I went. The bus ride felt longer than the years I had been gone. I watched the world change through street glass buildings that seemed smaller now, roads more cracked, corners more forgotten. My hands were still calloused from rifle work, but I could feel them shaking in my lap. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. She hadn't aged in my mind, but I knew that couldn't be true. Liana would be taller. Kevin, he would still be Kevin. That part I never had to guess. As we neared the edge of the city, I started recognizing things. The mural at the underpass, once bright with reds and yellows, now faded and peeling. The gas station where I once bought ice cream for Liana after school, its windows covered now in bars. The turn into our block was like slipping into a room where all the air had been used up. I got off the bus and walked the last 3 blocks. My bag felt heavier with every step, not because of the weight, but because of what waited at the end of that walk. The houses looked tired, like old people waiting for someone to speak their name. And when I saw our building, it was like seeing a version of myself I hadn't met in years. Same chipped steps. Same door, rusting at the bottom where the paint had long since given up. The buzzer still didn't work. I climbed the stairs quietly, more from instinct than necessity. My boots hit each step like a drum, a slow, heavy rhythm. I hesitated in front of the door. I thought I heard something. A voice maybe, then a second. I smiled. They're home, I thought. I'd knock, make a joke, surprise them. But then I heard it. Not just voices, raised ones. A man shouting, a woman saying something muffled, then a sharp noise, a kind of slap, dull but definite. Then something scraped the floor. A chair? A foot? I didn't know, but I knew what had happened. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door. It swung open without resistance. I stepped inside and the hallway felt like the air had frozen. Dim light flickered from the kitchen. The television was on in the living room, muttering to no one. And then I saw her. She stood in the far corner, one hand to her face. Her shoulder had jerked back, and her whole body was twisted in a way that told me she hadn't expected it. I saw her eyes, not full of tears, but full of something worse. Acceptance. She didn't even look surprised. Liana stood nearby, rigid as a statue, hands balled into fists, her lips trembling. She looked at me, then looked back at him. And then I saw Kevin. His hand was still half raised. He was breathing heavy, like someone who had run too far without knowing why. His shirt was rumpled, jaw clenched, and his face contorted into something between fury and shame. But when he saw me, it all stopped. His whole body turned to stone. We locked eyes and the moment didn't move. It just held there, stretched between what had happened and what I had become in the years I'd been gone. I felt the old instincts rise in me, not rage, but precision. The same kind I felt on the field, when clarity becomes sharper than emotion. But I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not yet. I walked past Liana, who reached out as if unsure whether she should run to me or hide. I rested a hand on her shoulder gently, then moved forward until I was beside my mother. I didn't look at her. I didn't have to. She lowered her hand slowly. I saw the faint red mark on her cheek, a fresh one. I turned and sat at the table. Slowly, deliberately. Kevin hadn't moved. I heard the fridge open behind me. My mother still trying to pretend it was just a meal, just another day. She set down plates with hands that had served too many times to people who didn't deserve them. The silence thickened. Kevin moved to the other side of the table but didn't sit. Liana stood in the doorway, looking like a child who'd wandered into someone else's nightmare. I watched them all, not judging, not yet, but remembering. Every single scar they tried to hide from each other, and from themselves. I could still hear that sound, the one I had walked in on, the sound of a hand meeting the skin of the only person who had ever loved either of us without condition. And I realized that this wasn't a house anymore. It was a battlefield. But this time, I wasn't a soldier for someone else's cause. I was here for her, and I had come just in time. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the old cot in the room that hadn't changed in years, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house around me. Outside, the city exhaled the same sounds it always had. Distant sirens, cars idling too long, a dog barking like it had been forgotten. But inside, something had shifted, and I could feel it settling in the bones of the walls. After I walked in that evening and sat down at the table, nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. My presence alone had stilled everything. Kevin lowered his arm, but it might as well have remained raised, frozen in the air. My mother's hands trembled when she set the plate in front of me. Liana stood near the wall, her small body half hidden behind the frame of the doorway, eyes wide and unblinking. We ate in silence. There was no prayer, no clatter of conversation, no passing of dishes with familiar gestures. Only the sound of cutlery against plates and the occasional gulp when someone forced down a bite they didn't want. The food tasted of cardboard, as if guilt and shame had stripped it of all flavor. I watched each of them as they moved through the ritual of dinner like ghosts playing at normalcy. Kevin, across from me, kept his eyes on his plate. He chewed quickly, like he was trying to get through it all as fast as possible, pretending he didn't feel my gaze pressing against him. He shifted in his seat, wiped his mouth more than necessary, cleared his throat to fill the void, but he never looked up. My mother sat next to me, her spine straighter than usual, though I could tell it was effort, not pride, holding her up. Her hands, once sure and graceful even in exhaustion, fumbled slightly with the utensils. Her eyes stayed on her food, but every so often she glanced toward Liana, as if silently checking that the girl hadn't disappeared into the walls. And Liana? She didn't eat at all. She sat down at the table only when my mother motioned gently. She held a spoon, stirred her rice, but brought nothing to her mouth. Her eyes flicked from her father to me and back again, uncertain where safety might be hiding. I kept my voice silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because there were things that needed more than words. There are moments when speaking too soon robs a truth of its weight. I needed them to feel the presence of what had happened without the comfort of explanation. That night, after the table was cleared and the dishes rinsed in near total silence, I retreated to my room. The cot creaked beneath me, the same way it had when I was a boy afraid to sleep with the door closed. The same posters were on the wall, football players, faded now. The ceiling had the same stain in the corner, from the leak that was never fixed. It all should have felt familiar, but it didn't. The house wasn't what I remembered. Maybe it never had been. I stared at the ceiling and thought of my mother's face. I tried to recall it before the red mark bloomed across her cheek. I thought of how many times she had hidden bruises, not on her body, but in her spirit. How many nights had she gone to bed praying for a better morning that never came? And Kevin. I thought about him more than I wanted to, about the boy he had been, about how angry he'd always seemed, even when he had no reason. I remember the way he looked at me when I first arrived in this house years ago. The way he had refused to speak to me for weeks. I wasn't his brother. I was an intruder, a reminder of something he hadn't been able to keep for himself. He had been born into the house. I had been brought into it. But only one of us had ever called it home. Sleep didn't come. Instead, memories marched across my mind in quiet formation. I saw myself crouched behind the couch, hiding from his voice raised at our mother. I saw the way she'd rushed to calm him, as if she were the one who'd done something wrong. I remembered once when he'd slammed a door so hard it cracked the frame. I had gone to school the next day telling myself he was just tired, but I knew better. When I finally rose, the sky outside was pale. Morning. I hadn't closed my eyes. I heard my mother in the kitchen, her steps light but hurried. She was always first up, no matter what life threw at her. That morning was no exception. I stepped out into the hallway. The house felt colder than usual. Kevin hadn't come out of his room yet, and Liana's door was still shut. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother preparing breakfast. She turned, startled, but managed a small smile when she saw me. It didn't reach her eyes. I took the kettle from her hands and finished heating the water. She watched me for a moment, then silently moved to set the plates. We worked together in a rhythm that didn't need words. Years apart hadn't broken the understanding we shared. When Kevin entered, it was as if someone had dropped a heavy curtain over the room. He muttered a greeting I didn't acknowledge. I felt him watching me as I served Liana her food, the way a wolf watches something it can't decide to fear or fight. His presence was wrong in the room. It always had been. We ate again in silence, but this time it was not the same. This time, the silence was intentional. I watched Kevin's every move. His fork paused midway to his mouth when he noticed. I didn't look away. Neither did Liana. She had started copying me, I realized. Her eyes followed her father, but not like a daughter's might. It was the way someone watches for danger. The moment breakfast ended, I stood and addressed him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't invite discussion. I simply said what needed to happen. And he followed, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Authority, the kind he couldn't dismiss. We stepped outside into the brittle light of morning. He turned toward me, trying to act casual, like none of what had happened the night before mattered. He made a weak attempt at humor. I didn't respond. His words fell into the cold air and disappeared. I could feel the tension building in him. He didn't like not being the biggest voice in the room. He had gotten used to power by way of absence of resistance, absence of challenge. But now I was home, and I wasn't the same boy he'd tormented years ago. I didn't raise my fists. I didn't call him names. I didn't spit rage. I simply stood before him and let him see what I had become. He tried to puff himself up, but his eyes kept darting away. It was all there in the way he fidgeted, the way he couldn't keep still. I told him I'd be speaking to him later, not as a brother, as a man, and I meant every word. When we came back inside, my mother stood by the window, her back to us. Liana was on the couch, drawing something in a notebook. She looked up at me, eyes searching, asking without words if everything would be okay. I didn't answer out loud, but I walked over and sat beside her. That would have to be enough for now. The day unfolded under a veil of strained quiet, not because peace had been restored, but because something deeper had taken root, a recognition of the truth none of us wanted to say out loud. After breakfast, Kevin disappeared into his room and closed the door like a barrier against the reality that had finally breached his little kingdom. My mother busied herself in the kitchen longer than she needed to, wiping the same counter over and over again. Liana sat near the window with her notebook in her lap, her pencil unmoving, her eyes distant. I stayed close but said nothing. I didn't want to break the stillness yet. It needed to settle in. Later that morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to draw stark shadows across the living room floor, I stepped outside and stood at the edge of the porch. The neighborhood was waking up in its usual way. Children playing in the street, a radio blaring through an open window, someone sweeping a stoop. Normalcy drifted around us like dust in the light, untouched by what was happening inside our walls. I knew what I had to do next, and I wasn't looking forward to it. When I came back in, I found Kevin in the hallway. He had just come from the bathroom, towel draped around his neck, a cigarette between his fingers. His eyes flicked toward me, narrowed. He knew. He had been waiting for it. I stood in front of him, blocking his path to the kitchen. My voice was calm, measured, but left no room for retreat. I told him we were going to talk, not now, soon, that he should be ready. Then I turned and walked away. It wasn't a request. The rest of the day crawled by. Kevin lingered around the house, pretending to look busy, pretending not to glance at me every time I entered the room. My mother avoided us both, her hands restless with pointless chores, and Liana watched everything, silently folding what she saw into the pages of her mind, like a child trying to memorize the rules of a game where the rules changed every day. In the early afternoon, I sat on the back steps, watching the wind pull dry leaves across the yard. I remembered doing the same thing as a boy, back when I had first come to this house. I had sat here wondering if I would ever truly belong, wondering if Kevin would ever accept me. He never had. The memory that returned was sharp. Kevin slamming the bedroom door in my face the night I moved in, telling me not to touch his things, not to talk to him, not to forget that I wasn't blood. I remembered how I had nodded, turned away, and cried into my pillow in silence. Back then, I had thought it would pass, that if I was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, he'd change. But he never did, because my presence wasn't his problem. It was my place in our mother's heart that he couldn't forgive. By the time late afternoon rolled around, the air inside the house had grown so thick it felt like trying to breathe through cotton. Kevin came into the living room and stood near the wall, arms crossed, watching me with that same guarded expression he always used when he felt cornered. I stood up slowly. He knew it was time. We walked outside, down the steps, out into the yard. There was no crowd, no witness but the wind. Just us. Two men shaped by the same woman, but nothing else. He started talking first, trying to control the conversation before it started. He called the night before a misunderstanding, claimed he'd been tired, said my mother exaggerated things, said Liana misunderstood. His voice was laced with mockery, like he was trying to make it all seem small, manageable. I let him speak. I stood there, arms at my sides, eyes locked on his face. And when he was done, I stepped closer and said what needed to be said. That I had seen him strike our mother, that I had seen Liana cry, that this wasn't about a bad day or a sharp tongue. It was about what he had become. A man who raises his hand to the woman who carried him has no right to call himself a man. His expression cracked, his mouth twisted, and his shoulders drew back like he was about to fight. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't a boy anymore. And I wasn't going to be the one to throw the first blow. If he wanted to fight, he would have to cross a line I knew he was afraid of now. Instead, he shouted. The words came fast and sharp. He accused me of stealing his place, of always being the favorite, of turning our mother against him. He said I was the outsider, that she had only brought me in because she pitied me. He said she gave me what was his. And there it was, the heart of it, his resentment, festering for years, finally spilling into the open. I didn't argue. I just stood there and let him see that his words didn't move me, that I had heard them before 100 times in his tone, in his silences, in his glares. But this time I wasn't retreating. Then a small sound behind us cut through the air like glass. We turned. Liana stood at the top of the steps, arms hugging herself, eyes wide with something deeper than fear. It was something more permanent, a hollowing. She had heard everything. And she stepped down one stair then another until she stood between us. Her voice, when it came, was soft, barely a whisper. She said she didn't want her father to come home anymore, that she was scared when he was here, that when he yelled, she felt sick inside, that when he hit Grandma, she didn't want to sleep in the same house, that she didn't feel safe. Kevin's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at me, then at her, then away, and then she turned and ran. It happened so fast. Her foot caught on the edge of the bottom step. She slipped, fell forward, hit the ground hard. A sharp cry escaped her mouth. I ran. My knees hit the pavement beside her before I realized I had moved. I lifted her gently, checking for blood, for broken bones. Her arm was scraped, her cheek bruised, but her eyes were the worst. She didn't cry. She just blinked, dazed, as if she had expected it. I carried her inside, my heart beating like war drums in my chest. My mother gasped when she saw us. She ran to wet a cloth, to fetch ointment, to find a blanket. But I told her no. We needed more than a bandage. We needed help. I took Liana to the hospital. In the car, she leaned against me without words, her small hand gripping my sleeve like a lifeline. Kevin didn't come. He stood in the doorway, unmoving, as we drove off. At the hospital, the lights were too bright, the walls too clean. The nurse asked questions, took notes. A doctor examined her carefully, gently. I stayed in the room the whole time. I held her hand and whispered promises I hadn't made in years. When the doctor finished, he pulled me aside, told me the physical injuries were minor, but the psychological stress, that was different. The child was clearly traumatized. He asked about the home environment, and I didn't lie. He told me what I already knew, that this wasn't just about what happened that day. It was about everything before it. And that if it continued, something deeper would break in her. I thanked him and returned to the room. Liana was asleep, curled up beneath a too-white sheet. My mother sat beside her, eyes wet, hands folded in her lap. I sat across from her and watched them both. And I knew this had to end. Whatever loyalty we thought we owed Kevin, whatever excuses we had told ourselves to keep him close, it was over. Because children shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' failures, and mothers shouldn't have to flinch in their own homes. I looked at Liana and promised myself that from now on, this house would not be a place of silence and fear. It would be something better. A home. The ride back from the hospital was quiet. Liana slept most of the way, her head resting against my chest, her breath warm and shallow. My mother sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, fingers pale from the pressure. She didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be too little or too late. The truth had been spoken aloud by a child, and in her small, tired voice, she had stripped away every illusion we had tried to protect. When we entered the house, the light had dimmed. Evening was spreading across the floor in long, slanted shadows. Kevin wasn't in sight. I didn't ask where he was. My mother carried Liana to her bed, tucking her in with the same gentleness she had always used, as if routine could still save something. I watched her from the hallway, her silhouette framed in the doorway, still and quiet, like a statue carved from grief and endurance. When she stepped out, her eyes met mine, and I saw it there, the final, weary line she had drawn within herself. We sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The house felt different now, heavier but also hollow, like it had been cracked open and was now trying to figure out how to put itself back together. My mother sat in the armchair, her shoulders hunched forward. I sat on the couch, elbows on my knees, hands clasped. We listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of a neighbor's television. It felt like waiting for something to break. Eventually, Kevin returned. He came in through the back door, as if afraid of being seen. His steps were slower than usual, and his face was pale. He paused in the kitchen, maybe thinking we had all gone to bed. But when he saw us in the living room, he stopped. He stood there for a long moment, then lowered his gaze and walked in. He didn't sit. He remained near the wall, close to the shadows, as if even the furniture had turned against him. My mother looked up but didn't speak. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't scold or plead. She just looked at him with a gaze that no longer begged to be understood. Then slowly she rose from her chair. She walked over to him, not hurried, not hesitant. And when she stood in front of him, she spoke. Her voice was low, calm, but unshakable. She said she had been silent too long, that she had forgiven too many times, that love was not something meant to survive bruises or fear, that she had loved him, yes, because he was her son. But being her son didn't give him the right to make their home a battlefield. She said he was not her son if he could not be a man, if he could not show the smallest measure of respect to the woman who had given him everything. She told him quietly but firmly that he no longer had a place in this house unless he chose to become someone worthy of it. Kevin didn't answer. His mouth opened slightly, as if the words might come, but none did. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not younger, just diminished. He was seeing himself the way we had all seen him for years. The curtain had fallen, and behind it was not a man, but a frightened boy who had never grown beyond his pain. He turned away and walked toward the hallway, but this time he didn't slam a door behind him. The next morning was cold and gray. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, and the scent of damp wood filled the air. I rose early, not because I had slept well, but because I needed to move. In the kitchen, I found my mother already awake, stirring oatmeal on the stove. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was quiet in the way a field is quiet after a storm. Liana came in later, walking slowly, her cheek still swollen. She didn't look for her father. She simply came to me, took my hand, and sat beside me. My mother served her breakfast with the same care as always, but now there was something different. A kind of permission, a space where something better might begin to grow. Kevin didn't join us that morning. Hours passed, and still we heard nothing from his room. At first, I thought he had left, but then I heard the faint creak of the door and the shuffle of feet in the hallway. I turned, expecting nothing, but what I saw caught me off guard. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, unsure of where to step. His eyes flicked to Liana, then to my mother, then to me. For the first time, his posture wasn't defensive. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work, but the kind that comes from seeing yourself clearly for the first time. He stepped into the room and paused. Then slowly he moved to the counter and began helping. He took bowls from the cupboard, set them down, filled a glass of water. He didn't speak. He didn't look for approval. He just did it. When breakfast was over, he cleared the dishes without being asked. He wiped the table, rinsed the sink, dried his hands. My mother watched him, her expression unreadable. Liana leaned against me, whispering something I couldn't quite hear, but she was smiling, just a little. That night the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence. It wasn't brittle. It wasn't full of fear. It was simply rest, stillness. The kind that comes after something long and painful has been faced and finally allowed to change. I packed my bag the next morning. I had come without a plan, and now it was time to leave without one. This wasn't my place to stay. I had done what I came to do. The rest was up to them. Before I left, I sat with Liana in the living room. She drew a picture in her notebook, 3 figures standing beneath a tree, holding hands. One of them was taller than the others. I didn't ask who it was meant to be. I stood at the door and looked at my mother. She came to me, wrapped her arms around me. It was the kind of hug that doesn't ask for anything, only gives. I held her tightly and whispered that she was stronger than any of us, stronger than I'd ever be. I turned to Liana. She ran to me, threw her arms around my waist. I kissed the top of her head and told her to be brave, that she already was. Then I turned to Kevin. He stood near the hallway, hands in his pockets. I didn't offer a handshake. I didn't offer forgiveness. I simply looked at him and said the only thing I knew was true. Forgiveness isn't something you're given. It's something you earn. He nodded barely, and I walked out the door. As I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The sun hadn't come out yet, but there was light behind the clouds. I tightened the strap of my bag and looked back at the house one last time. I had come back to protect the woman who had saved me. I had stood between her and the sun she had never stopped hoping would change. And now maybe he would. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I had come just in time. And I hoped that when I returned again, I would find not silence or fear, but love. Real love. The kind that stays. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to continue the journey, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.